sejam de novo.
Welcome once again, so that we can continue with our works, which is the 32nd APDC Congress. You can use the Congress's platform, download its app, and visit our virtual booth. We've spoken about disruption, which is the motto of this Congress, and soon to speak about sustainability in the digital era. João, how is disruption changing the way companies work? This is the transition era. We have so much information reaching us quickly, in a minute, how we can processes, how we can transform values. It's not only to create them, but values are becoming decisive on how economy is carried out, the working model which is changing. And soon we will be speaking with different speaks, but before, I'm going to have to change languages.
At DXC Leading Edge, it's also industry advisor of banking and capital markets at DXC Technology. He wrote several papers about the future trends and the technology. Today, we want him to talk about this great transition. I'm talking about the new keynote speaker. I think now he's ready. David Reimer. David, good morning. Are you there?
Good morning. Yes, hi there.
It's a pleasure and it's an honor to have you here. Welcome to Portugal, to Lisbon. Unfortunately, you are far away. By the way, where are you? Can I ask?
I'm in London.
In London.
I'm in London.
Foggy probably, right?
No, it's a nice day today, surprisingly.
I was just doing this small talk because this is one of the signs of the disruption. Right now, even the economy, the communication, it's doing in this way. So let's hear your thoughts about this great transition. David.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here at speaking at the conference. And today I'd like to talk about the great transition, which is a major disruption that's taking place in our economy. So our thinking is that there's a great transition is underway. And in many ways, we're going full circle, that the guiding principles of the economy that came from the Industrial Revolution are being overturned. And so the first aspect of this is that the principal basis of wealth creation has shifted away from physical assets, physical products, factories, transportation systems, etc., towards intangible assets based on information. The second major change is that there's a change in the beliefs about what business is for, about the purpose of business, a change from value, from economic value alone towards values that's often termed ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And then the third aspect of the transition is a transformation in the nature of work, away from a single place of work, set employment hours, single employer, towards much more variable models. And with such a huge disruption in the nature of the economy, it's only natural that requires new paradigms, new ways of thinking, as well as new ways of managing businesses and new technology. So let's come on to the first of those changes. So essentially, there's a very major shift taking place towards intangible assets, by which I mean IT, data, software, brands, patents, and design. And so whichever economic indicator you want to look at, whether that's capital and balance sheets, whether that's investment or economic returns, productivity, employment, in all of these areas, intangible assets now outweigh tangible assets. And in fact, that change took place really quite some time ago. And just to give you a very practical example of this, if you look at the iPhone, this is produced using commodity components that any firm can buy. But the outsized returns that Apple generates come from the intangibles that it puts around the tangible asset of the phone. It comes from its brand, from its design, from its ecosystem, from its app store, and it's those intangibles that are actually generating the value. So if we look at the implications of this, the first is a focus on revenue. So when intangible assets scale infinitely, for instance, you can use a Coca-Cola formula as many times as you like, then the focus is on revenue. It's on generating high quality intangible assets and then exploiting those at global scale. The whole thing here is that the costs will look after themselves because the costs were aligned linearly in proportion to the revenue. The second major change is IT is right at the center of all of this. So IT is in itself a significant intangible asset, but it also enables so many of the other assets. So if you look at, say, invention, the patents and design, these are all based around IT nowadays. And then the third major implication is a skills premium. So though we're living in a digital age, actually there's a premium on skills. So if there are outsized returns for intangible assets, then there are outsized returns for the people that create those assets, because ultimately they depend on invention and creativity. So there's a real skills premium. Let's come on to the second change. And this is a change in the beliefs around the purpose of business, a change from economic value alone to values, often termed environmental, social, and governance. And the first aspect of this is it's a belief that it's not just what you do, but how and why you do it. So the why is all about purpose-led business, about the idea that enterprises exist not just to create economic value, but also to bring value to other stakeholders. But also there's the belief that the how matters as well, that the impact on the environment is a significant factor, and so are factors such as diversity and even the governance of firms and of the people, the firms that one does business with. And if you look at ESG, the pressure for ESG is coming from multiple different stakeholders. It's coming from shareholders, but it's also coming from customers and employees who increasingly are seeking firms that have ESG at their center. And in many cases, customers are prepared to pay a premium for those products and services. And of course, there's a lot of regulation, especially in the European Union. And the third factor to pick up here is that in many cases there's a false choice between value and values. The idea that if you're going to look at ESG, that comes with an economic cost, but that isn't necessarily the case. So the studies by, for instance, Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley show that more sustainable firms actually have better economic returns. Likewise, there are countless studies that show that firms that are more diverse in terms of ethnicity and gender actually outperform those that are less diverse. And even employee engagement. So there's a study that shows that there's an additional economic return of 2% to 2.7% return if employees are more engaged. So you can have one and the other. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing is that you can see that this change is just not skin deep. This involves a fundamental redesign of processes, of products, of supply chains, and this goes far beyond simply regulatory compliance. The second aspect of this is a bit more of a focus on risk as opposed to cost. So there's a phrase that Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, uses, which is the tragedy of the horizons, that a narrowness of time frame within decisions are made, and the narrowness of the factors that are considered leads to this kind of tragedy where economic and other returns are suboptimal. And the thing is that when you start to think about a longer time frame and a wider range of factors, you start to think much more about risk, and things that may or may not happen in 2 years, they will happen if you look at a 10-year time frame. And then the third aspect here is the notion of escaping the ESG trap. That firms don't just look at have the cost of regulatory compliance and then potentially missing out on the upsides of sustainability, the upside in terms of revenue from ESG products and services, and from more engaged employees and a more diverse workforce. So it's about having the upside as well as the downside, as it were, of ESG. And the third major change is a change in the structure of work from a single model in terms of single location, set hours, and a single employer to much more varied models. And the first aspect of this that I'm sure we're all familiar with is increased home working, but there are other aspects as well. So for instance, there's starting to see signs of a decline of a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday work pattern. So for instance, Iceland and now more recently the UK have conducted very large pilots of a 4-day week that involve, yes, 80% of the hours, but still 100% of the pay, and just as crucially, 100% of the productivity of the output. And those pilots have proved very successful. In fact, in the UK, 90% of the companies that started that pilot are continuing and putting that into practice. And then the third aspect of this is the gig economy. And I'm sure we're all familiar with Uber and Deliveroo and so on, but this actually goes much deeper than that. It goes right across professional services with all sorts of marketing, design, IT workers now working through the gig economy, connected by platforms and working on a piece rate. So what are the implications of this? Well, it means a hybrid model, a mixture of not just location of work, but of different contract types. And the key here is finding the right balance, not just for a firm as a whole, but actually looking at the individual tasks and activities and working out what the right balance is for that particular area or an aspect of the business in terms of place of work, hours of work, contracts or employee. And then finally, there's a real key aspect to this, which is that there's a very much a war for talent. As we've seen, there's a skills premium for workers that are able to create intangibles. And a lot of these workers then value their working conditions very highly. And that factors into this kind of attraction, the war for talent. And so what does that all mean? What does that all add up to for enterprises? Well, fundamentally, this great transition calls for new paradigms, new ways of thinking, new ways of new mental models. The problem, though, is that most managers are still looking at the world through 20th century goggles, through their glasses from the last century. And if we compare the two paradigms from the Industrial Revolution versus the Great Transition, there's some fundamental changes. So in terms of management, Industrial Revolution is much more about financial measures and about efficiency, whereas the Great Transition, yes, it's looking at financials, but also looking at ESG outcomes. And it's also looking very, very much with a focus on revenue and risk, and perhaps slightly less so on cost. But even the maths are changing as well. The Industrial Revolution is all about multiplication, subtraction, and division and multiplication. Whereas if you look at exponential returns, and you have tipping points and feedback in the business. And also, it's also, yes, still about automation, but also about enabling human to produce those intangible assets that are generating outside returns. And also looking at technology increasingly, not just as a cost center, but as a basis for revenue, increasing revenue and reducing risk. And then finally, the changes to data and analytics. So instead of sort of dashboards and a push model and internal and structured data, increasingly it's about much more dynamic ways of looking at data, about graphs and models and self-service and pulling data, with data much more coming from outside the firm and much more unstructured data. So in summary, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing this great transition with three key factors: the move towards intangible assets, move towards ESG, towards values in addition to value, and changes in the structure of work. And inevitably that brings new ways of management and new types of technology. But the key to all of this, the starting point, is actually the us. If we want to succeed in this new world.
Well, David, can you hear me? Just to let you know that we are having some problems. I mean, your image is frozen right now, but I think we can still hear you. Let's try again. Can you conclude your presentation, please? David?
I can certainly hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, hi there.
Your voice is arriving in Lisbon in perfect conditions. The problem is the picture, so go on to have the conclusion, please. And now...
No, sorry, I finished the conclusion there.
No, that's okay. Continue. We don't have your image right now. It's frozen, but we have your voice. And we can hear you clearly and loudly.
Okay, so did you hear the last slide, or shall I?
Please, just the conclusion of the last slide.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, we have new paradigms that are required, new ways of thinking about management and technology. In terms of management, it's not just about finance and efficiency, but also about other outcomes, and also about revenue and risk, and even different mathematics. So instead of addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, we're in a world of exponential growth where there are feedback loops and tipping points. And in terms of technology, it's not just a matter of automation, removing human.
And now we lost him completely. David, just thank you. That's the problem sometimes of this great transition, and to speak and work with people far away. It's a good start for our conversation. David, thank you so much. And if you want to continue to hear our conversation here in Lisbon, you have translation in our app. Thank you, David. It was a pleasure to have you here. Bom, penso...
Well, thank you, David Rimmer, that concluded this presentation, although there were some hiccups. Now, moving on to our the members of the panel: Hugo Bernardes, Managing Partner, Quital in Portugal; Luísa Ribeiro Lopes, Chair of the Board of Directors, PT; Manuel Maria Correia, General Manager, Portugal DXC Technology. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So we've just heard David Raymond's presentation, and we need to assess how we work and what should be done. And so let me start with, is this the concern when you're looking for talent, which is rare and specialized? When looking for someone to work in a company, bearing this in mind, that is to change the way of working and leading. So we need to try to find those that can work as such. This compels a very deep reflection from the company's side and leadership as well, because today it's very difficult to attract and to be able to retain people in these organizations. There's a talent war that's been existing for a long time, but now the variables are changing, which makes it difficult to implement. But picking up on what David has said, that is, the deep changes in work makes there be no longer frontiers, transition work from home to in person. And this model led the workers to adapt, or are they the new workers that have made this change? When we hire, they're concerned with what people are doing to produce value. The purpose is very important, especially for new generation. This is taken into account in the decision-making process. This leads us to, unfortunately, which hasn't been worked on as deeply in Portugal, which is directly linked to the value purpose. The employee value proposition has to be worked on, deeply worked on, and has to be communicated and maintained and walk the talk. Useless to create these value proposals, which are very nice on paper from a communication strategy viewpoint, but when people work in these organizations, they understand that it's not as such. And there is a transition that is occurring, because there is more and more pressure from the new employees, but of our generations that are quite aware of that purpose. Luísa Ribeiro Lopes, technology have a different role. They're decisive, fail, but it's part of the job. To what extent this disruption that we're seeing technologically in the economy and so on is compelling this change on how technology is used to work to create value and to make how we work differently, make the way we work differently. Thank you, João. This topic is very interesting. And Kelly mentioned that we're seeing a world which is changing, fascinating for those that are experiencing it, and it's great. And on the other hand, David mentioned that this great transition recenters the world in people. This is very interesting. We've been quite amazed with technology, globalization, the numbers. We were numbers, and what we are seeing nowadays is the fact that people are the center, are at the heart of the decision on how they want to work, decision what companies they want to choose to work in, and how they see values themselves. Of course, profit is very interesting but there are other values that companies are very concerned with, and which make a difference because they're centered, they're focusing on people's values. Only with these values, it's admissible to create value. Will we create more value taking into account this value? As David explained, this move towards intangible assets made by people with talent, while other assets sometimes don't need great talent. Today, we need people with talents for these assets, for the assets dominating our market. Just to say something else, we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat, and this is important. And these companies are the drivers of the economy, especially of this economy, should also push other companies. We have an entrepreneurial fabric, which for this is a bit strange when we look at the sustainability directive, when we think that in 2027 small enterprises will have to report their sustainability. Let's imagine how this will be possible, how this will be done, how companies with big technological companies can push the others. In the end, we're the driver behind the economy. We have to enable, we have to support, we have to collaborate, as this was mentioned, and making that this big transition uses all, everyone, and also uses all companies, organizations, and the third sector, which is equally important. And no, Manuel Maria Correia, we started speaking about values, and my question is quite often the word profit is important nonetheless. How can we take into account the sustainability, equality values? That is to create more value, create more wealth, making companies grow more. Thank you for the invitation addressed. Thank you, APDC President Rogério Carapuço, Congress President Pedro Cisa Vieira, and all members of the panel. David spoke about that aspect in his presentation. He spoke about the trap, the ESG trap. What is this ESG trap? That is, companies saying, let's adopt the ESG, and then there's a checklist, they're just ticking and that checklist and leaving aside the value. We need to incorporate these values, behavior in all organizational process, the corporate culture, and the governance of itself. And this is how the value is extracted. Obviously, companies have understood. There are studies conducted by McKinsey. I'm not going to mention more, but there are studies that have been conducted mentioning that companies have already incorporated the ESG practice. The ESG, they're more profitable. Employee engagement is greater, bringing more return. So they're is an obvious value in adopting these value and this transition where we stand, and commenting why it's called great transition, because we don't know yet. We're halfway on a bridge, but I agree with what Lisa has said. For us, it's important to be able to experience this moment. Why, Manuel, why have we taken so long to reach a conclusion which seems to be so obvious? To create value, considering values as people, we highlight as being the more important one. Was it a generational one? Yes, you have that experience when you hire someone. The questions asked to a candidate. Yes, we have experts in the hiring side. When we interview different generations, we see what each generation seeks is very different. The younger generations are not so much connected to tangible assets, that is, of having a job for life, a house, a car. And today, it's what we've mentioned earlier, this migration from the Industrial Revolution, where we transform raw materials into goods and products. And now, and what was intangible value now has become tangible, and the process is the other way around. The value is in people, knowledge, and goods will no longer be that important. And what's going to be important is people's experience, their mind. AI, for instance, just leaving you with that brief remark, it's going to enhance the adoption. AI will enhance our mind, our brain to be developed more and not less. This theory can be discussed, but as I was saying, we see now that there's this turning point. Of course, it will take time, and obviously, there's a difference of the generation. Their vision is very different, and the world is adapting. Up to what extent, Bernardo, and picking up on what we're speaking about, the paradigm shift, when a director, I don't like the word boss, but an employer interviewing an applicant, he's he asks questions, he defends values. Is he part of that great transition? Can it be decisive for that applicant to say, no, I don't want that position? Yes, it does happen. It does happen. And the selection, the final selection process depends on the candidate's will. It's remarkable in our national market. This is seen at a final stage in a higher percentage of people rejecting because they think that the director or the organization itself does not convey the values or the way of being that the candidate was seeking, that is rejecting the job offer. And you also spoke about another aspect, and not as an exacerbate, but it's undeniable that information, we're speaking about an information economy, is more and more important. That is, those with more information can make more valuable and correct decisions. My question is the other way around. Do we know how to use well the information that we have easily, that we store, or will we run the risk of being stifled? It's important to distinguish what is fundamental from what isn't. And there's also here a battle. The organization have to capture the attention of their future candidates and have to attract their attention, where we're all being bombarded with information today. Young people have access to a lot more information in 2 hours than what we had in years ago. So this is absolutely essential to attract one's attention and thinking. And speaking about AI, it's to be able to have a critical thought in terms of transition. Well, because the impact will have transformational consequences, like in education. There's an impact in on universities. People will not take a university course, but would specialize themselves not in other skills. What type of skills I need, where can they be identified, regardless of cost? So what I need are skills to meet given needs, and the gig economy becomes more and more fundamental, intersecting the non-linearity of frontiers. Luisa, this information, which is essential and which is quite valuable, that more than the assets or goods we thought were the most valuable on the planet, up to what extent selection on one hand, storage and access to information is at this moment a dilemma when we think technologically, because there's quite a lot of information storage, it can be lost and then we can not use it.
In reality, today we live in the economy of information, the economy of data, of those who have more data, processes those data better, and provides a better service. Is that the case? Well, I see Nell not agreeing. Well, it should be like that. The way we process data, and we can discuss that later on, because this cannot be the only panel where we don't talk about AI. And if we use AI in processing data and how it is used in the so-called critical capacity that Hugo was talking about. And this is what we need to teach, the critical capacity, namely in the education, because our education is too far away from the reality. If we look only at K-12, it is out of touch with reality, and there's no one to blame. I'm not judging. There's a way to teach which is not the one which is needed for this major transition. We're talking about education in general or specifically in Portugal? In general and also in Portugal. Portugal performs very well vis-à-vis other European countries in what concerns skills and competences. And Císia Vieira mentioned this. In 1974, we had over 80% of illiterate in Portugal. Today, our population is better qualified. Over 80% of young people go to polytechnics, unis. So there was a major leap forward. And if we look at skills and competencies, we perform very well comparably with the EU. This is indeed an opportunity, and Portugal has the necessary skills to take advantage of this opportunity. Do we retain our young people in the country? That's another conversation. Manuel, companies that have more information, more capacity to store and better use data are those that are more successful? So you were disagreeing with what? It's not only those that have more data, because you can have a lot of data if they're useless or not used. Some years ago, we realized having data would be important, and companies started collecting data. And in every conference, we will talk about the cloud and big data. And regarding ChatGPT, I'll mention it and it's done. I ticked the box. Companies today try to develop their businesses and their activities, transforming things based upon the information they have, their services, their clients, new business lines, new products based on information. So the more information you have, you are better positioned. How can we avoid the risk? And this is connected with what we've been talking about, namely AI. In particular today, when I have an avatar that says things that go against my beliefs, how can you fight fake news and ill-intended information. AI, like all big innovations, have the side of risk and the side of opportunity. We're talking about the risks. Being this a very powerful technology, it entails big risks, very big ones. And it's difficult to tell the difference between a lie and the truth in the social media. And when this technology is wrongly used, we can lead people to believe things that are not true. And this has happened in politics because people believe in things that are not true. But again, having reliable data that can be provided to people is crucial. It's not about manipulating. Do we have this critical attitude in our companies already or not? Besides this tool that can be used as a sieve to do this screening. In Portugal, 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we established a technological hub, a reflection group, a think tank on digital ethics, because this is how we use such a powerful tool. Let's use the example of a hammer. It is a powerful tool, and you can hammer things with them, but if you put a hammer in the hands of a 3-year-old, it can cause damages. So, if we apply this metaphor to AI, of course, this technology in the wrong hands also can create problems. But like in everything, there will be an evolution, there will be regulating mechanisms that will fight and mitigate these risks. And most companies in this market are responsible companies. There's legislation, and this will also be done by governments and the EU also. That is leading legislation on data privacy, and we need to work in this direction. We all like to talk about AI. Later on, we will also have other experts approaching the topic, but this is a concern for several young talents. Knowing how to use AI, or this is also seen by many young people as the tool that will render us jobless. How can we fight this ghost when there's an algorithm that can make a decision instead of being done by 3-4 workers? I think not all people, young people, look at AI like that. They will look at it as a tool with all the digital tools. But some young people are concerned with this. I would say this is a legitimate concern, like so many others. At the beginning of this conference, it was said that in 2030, 80% of the businesses that exist today will cease to exist because of automation and different ways of working, and this will have an impact. But as these jobs disappear, other jobs are created. And we're talking about skilled workers. Skilled workers will always have the possibility to have a job or to perform a given function based upon his or her qualifications. And qualifications are very important. Without it, people have less working opportunities, namely those that can ensure a given social status, social progression, because of course qualifications impact your salary. With some years of experience, where do we stand in this hybrid model that we have adopted? Most companies opt for more days of remote work, hybrid work. How is it working? I think in the middle is where the virtue stands. Hybrid is the model that is more commonly adopted, but there are also large companies stepping back, going back to in-presence models. And what is the reason? It's about the engagement, involvement of teams, and because we're social beings, and the lack of capacity of leaderships to change their management. So, increasingly, and this is also seen in Portugal, younger workers, skilled, qualified workers, they prefer the hybrid model. Is this generational? Generational? Yes, it is. It depends on the individual profile of each person and the social profile. I would say that someone who lives alone prefers to have her social component linked to his professional activity. But I would say it's generational. And this increases the difficulty in attracting these young professionals. Luisa, workers started saying, I prefer this hybrid model for several reasons. And we are here today discussing how the economy, how we lead, is something that is being changed. What about leaders, people in front of businesses? And I'm not only talking about costs, possible reduction of costs. Do they see this as beneficial, or are they having difficulties in adapting? There isn't a single answer to your question. There are those who have understood that it makes sense and that organizations have gained with this hybrid model, and also by leading by example. And they also follow this hybrid model, and workers feel comfortable. There are other leaders, as we know, who like the traditional model with the physical presence, with the interaction, and also with some control that these leaders have. Now, regarding AI and values and data, and there's also the creative and critical capacity in using data. Something that we've heard also today, and that new generations know this better than I do, is time. It's nice to have time. We belong to the generation of the workaholics, and the good worker was the one that worked 14, 15 hours a day. Today, a good worker doesn't need to work this many hours, and young people privilege time and the other things they want to do with their lives besides work. AI, the good part, of course, because if we consider the risks, we could also have another panel devoted to that alone. The issue is we can automate many tasks and create more time. Why should we all work 8 hours a day? That's a question young people ask today. Does this make sense? Why don't we all have a job, but we work less? But then there's the issue of the salary. Well, it will depend on your productivity. We are all here to generate wealth. This has been made clear, and I entirely agree. It's not the number of hours or repetitive tasks that can be done by machines a lot better than we do without the mistakes we make, but we can nonetheless generate more wealth. And then my answer is always to invest in education. How can we tell the difference between what is right and wrong, what is true or not? How do we have critical capacity to judge what the machine gives us? The answer is always education. Manuel, with this new hybrid model, and I would like to have your opinion on this, is this to be continued? Should we go back? Are we able, from the perspective of businesses, to achieve more productivity for less time of work? And are we being more efficient? Is this model showing that more hours, it's not to be workaholic, that leads to more productivity and value? The answer is yes. In a very simple answer. I was thinking about this, and I was considering the 3 areas of transition. And David has this capacity. I've known him for several years, and he has the capacity to anticipate trends. And he said, and he has a study showing the facts of hybrid models, and there's no turning back. The thing is, how are we going to adapt to be productive? I think that we should have this approach in order to adapt. I say this, and I love this country. One of our problems is productivity, or it was. And this is at the world level. But when we look at Portugal, we are light years to reach that. For example, regarding the management style, cultural issues, business models that we have not adapted to. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're talking about trends and how the world is going to be. And I have no doubt the world will be increasingly hybrid. And what the pandemic brought to us was bad things, but also good things. And it showed us the big advantages of this model. It has problems. If it is entirely remote, there are cultural issues, social exclusion issues, people who isolated themselves, and they have not fully recovered by now. But from productivity point of view, it's more productive because we don't spend time commuting. Meetings are more practical, and this brings about more productivity. And organizations are adapting to this model. Some organizations already had these mechanisms, and that's their daily life already. But things are built based upon this model, and when they plan the future, they do it based upon this model. Let me also speak about the different generations. We have many difficulties in recruiting younger generations if a large percentage of the work is not remote. So the applicants don't want that, regardless of the salary. We wouldn't have a lot of time, so I'll give you 1 minute each. And then David and the thinkers say this, and we smile. Happiness at work. I think it's essential. Are we already there? Are we already thinking that we can work with happiness? Personally, the term happiness at work is something that I do not subscribe. Can we not be happy when working? I think we should like what we do. But there are many variables that impact my day-to-day happiness. In any case, in Portugal, there's a trend of happiness at work. And this is, of course, positive because there's someone in the organization exclusively thinking about the employee experience, how the life cycle of the employee in the organization, since is recruited until she leaves the company, what kind of interactions can we have to... Is that important or not? Yes, it is. Okay. Are we creating happy at work companies or not yet? I think that the concept of happiness is so difficult to explain. But we're saying this generically. When I wake up in the morning, oh, I have to go to work. Or, great, I have to go to work. Well, we can create spaces where people feel good, they like to go to work. Of course, there are always other things in life that give other types of happiness. Instead of happiness at work, I prefer stimulating environments that people lead people to do things that make them feel enthusiastic. Manuel, is this something we should take into account? I think happiness is fundamental. It is fundamental. Well, to the limit, happiness does not exist. What exists is the path or way to happiness, and we need to have the best conditions in our organization so that people feel happy and feel like waking up in the morning and go to work. And it's said that when we reach happiness, we're not working. Our job becomes a hobby, and I believe this is our purpose. Our purpose is to create an environment where people feel happy. The largest number of times. So this is crucial. This paradigm shift, and this is what we should pursue day to day. In our day-to-day lives. Thank you so much to our three panelists. It was very important to carry out this reflection. And now it's time to go back to one of the topics approached before. Now, in detail, we're going to talk about sustainability.